In total, I spent 15,736 minutes listening to podcasts this year. I feel like that's a lot. So 2020 is coming to a close, and I want to talk about the top podcasts of 2020 because, as I just mentioned, I've heard over 15,000, almost 16,000 minutes worth of podcasts this year. I don't know if that's a lot. We're gonna put some equations or something right here as to what that equals in other time forms, but it sounds like a lot to me. So I want to go ahead and talk about it now. Spotify has sort of what is listed on their metrics, what they believe have been my top podcasts, but I want to see if I actually agree with them. This isn't the first time I'm looking at it, so it's not like a reaction. Sorry. But it has been a few weeks since I've actually looked at this, so I did kind of forget, and now I'm going to go ahead and talk about whether or not I agree with them. So there's that. So according to Spotify, my biggest podcast binge listen was the car buying podcast. Now, I kind of agree with that. I can see how it happened. I can see why it's a thing. However, I feel like I listened a lot to the New York Times podcast as well as the Code Switch podcast. But according to their metrics, the biggest binge specific podcast was the car buying podcast. That makes a lot of sense because back in February, so it's been a minute, I kind of forgot, but it did happen. I got a new car and I was listening to the car buying podcast as a way to get as informed as possible because I was going to the dealership. I hate going to the dealership. A lot of people hate going to the dealership. I still hate going to the dealership, but this podcast at least helped. I was able to prep me for some questions that were going to come my way, some of the tricky negotiations that they try to do, all that jazz. And this podcast was pretty helpful. It seems like a limited series. I don't think many other episodes have been uploaded. It just seems like an individual creator who had some time on their hands and wants to talk about their experience working in a dealership. So the car buying podcast makes sense. I'll leave that link down below if you're interested. If you're on your way to buy a car right now or within the next couple of weeks, you should definitely binge this podcast because it's pretty helpful. No. It wants me to guess my top podcast, but I told you this is after the car buying experience. I told you that I listened to a lot of New York Times and Code Switch. I also listened to a lot of Adorama's podcast, which is pretty helpful. They interview, filmmakers and photographers. So of course I'm going to be listening to that. The Ezra Klein show, well, I mean, it's an election year. That's about it. Oh, all right. So here we go. My top podcast of 2020. We have number 1, the New York Times. I kind of thought it was going to be that, but I want to pick Code Switch just to pick Code Switch. Okay, cool. Makes sense. I'm actually really surprised with the Ezra Klein show being the second one because I feel like I really only listened to that heading into November for the election. I don't feel like I listened to it that much beforehand. So that's actually pretty interesting, but I guess I listened to it enough that it was able to get up there in the top 5. It's really funny though, because again, like I said, it was mostly only for the election. So number 3 is Code Switch. That makes sense. I listen to like every single episode as soon as it comes out. Number 4 is the Adorama podcast, as I already talked about. Trying to stay creative. Adorama, thank you so much. And number 5 is Talking Cars from Consumer Reports. Alright, my top podcast genres were news, society, and culture and business. Cool. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Biggest binge podcast. Yeah, makes sense. You through your own car buying podcast. 8 episodes. I did listen to 8 episodes. That was a work day. But I'll say overall, regardless of metrics, regardless of the scientific data Spotify has, science, this is what I feel 2020 impact wise, what I liked, what I enjoyed, what I feel like I really liked. So yes, I will say the New York Times is probably up there. I wouldn't say number 1, but I did enjoy it. I did listen to it a lot. So New York Times is definitely on there as well. Aside from the New York Times though, it would actually be Frono's Photo. So similar to Jared Polin and Frono's Photos, his YouTube channel, I actually did listen to a lot of his podcasts as well. Code Switch, I feel like that's pretty accurate. I really enjoy Code Switch. I listen to them a lot. I listen to some Hidden Brain as well. I really like that podcast. Waveform, the MKBHD podcast. That podcast is so easy to just passively listen to. TED Radio Hour, because it's a TED Radio Hour. That's pretty good. This one I'm a little bit biased towards. If you know me, do you know me? If you follow me on social media, on my Instagram, on my Twitter, you'll see me talk about, retweet, and share El Paseo podcast. It's a podcast hosted by a good friend of mine named Joshua here in Chicago out of Humboldt Park. So I actually help with creating video content for that podcast. So totally 100% biased towards it, but you should check it out and watch it. Linked probably first in the description down below, just because I'm biased. I want you to watch that one first, but that's a big one too. There's a lot of good bingeable stuff on there. Check it out. You'll love it. You won't regret it. Trust me. Espresso Thoughts. That's my cousin's podcast. You should also definitely check that one out. Link down below. That's pretty much it. I mean, I just kind of listed, I didn't list all of the podcasts I listen to, but I feel like I probably listed like a good 70% of them. I feel like it's interesting, the 2020 rap, music wise, it totally makes sense. And I don't feel like I ever beef really with what Spotify says. It's pretty accurate when it comes to music. But podcasts, like, I don't know, to say like some were like my top 5 and others didn't even make the list for whatever reason. That's like, well, it's not that I disagree with it, but I want to give love to all the podcasts I listen to, because there's a lot of good ones out there. And I listen to them all probably on an equal basis. And so Spotify, I like your list. You got the science stuff. I can't argue with the science, but fake news, fake science, because I love all my podcasts equally. Overall, those are the podcasts that I listened to in 2020. I will leave them linked down below. I encourage that you check them out. Join me, engage with me. Have you listened to any of these podcasts? Do you like any of them as well? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is Josué and I live in Chicago, the greatest city in the world. Hope y'all have a happy New Year. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.